Night, February 1944, the Mussolini Canal. Anzio. A soldier with a blackened face lay motionless in the mud, 60 yards from a German machine gun nest. He hadn't fired a shot in 11 days. He didn't need to. Behind him, in the reeds along the canal, 11 more men waited in the dark. Faces painted the same matte black, knives drawn instead of rifles. 200 yards to the north, a colonel who should have been at headquarters was crawling through that same mud, leading the patrol himself. He had already survived a knife-edge cliff assault that made Winston Churchill call him the greatest fighting general alive. He would be wounded 8 times before this war ended. Tonight, he wasn't thinking about medals. By dawn, the Germans manning this stretch of the line would find something waiting on their dead, a small printed card, pasted to a helmet or a chest, bearing a single line in their own language, a warning, a promise. They didn't know what to call the men who left it. So they gave them a name that stuck for the rest of the war, the Black Devils. This is the story of how a handful of American and Canadian soldiers, led by a general who refused to stay behind the lines, turned the most miserable stretch of the Italian campaign into the enemy's worst nightmare. Robert Tryon Frederick was not supposed to be a legend. He was supposed to be a paperwork officer. He was born on March 14, 1907, in San Francisco, the son of a physician and a nurse, and he grew up in a house where precision mattered, where things were done correctly or not at all. He went to West Point, graduated in 1928, and spent the following decade the way most career officers did in peacetime, shuffled between postings, writing reports nobody outside the War Department would ever read, building a reputation not for daring, but for competence. He was not a large man. He did not look like a soldier from the recruiting posters. He looked like what he was, a staff officer, sharp-eyed and quiet, the kind of man who noticed when a supply requisition didn't add up. Men who served under him later would struggle to describe what made him different from every other colonel they'd known. It wasn't his voice, which stayed level even when the situation didn't call for level. It wasn't his build, which was unremarkable. It was something in the way he listened to a briefing, the way his eyes moved across a map like he was already 3 moves past whatever question was being asked. He did not waste words. He did not waste men either, not carelessly, though the war would eventually cost plenty regardless of how carefully he spent them. In February 1942, newly promoted to lieutenant colonel, Frederick was handed a proposal that would change the rest of his life, though not in the way anyone expected. The plan came from a British scientist named Geoffrey Pike, and it was called Operation Plough. Pike wanted a small commando force, trained to operate on snow and ice, dropped behind enemy lines in occupied Norway to sabotage hydroelectric plants and Nazi war industry. It called for specialized snow vehicles that did not yet exist, terrain assumptions that strained credibility, and a level of coordination that Frederick, reading it line by line, did not believe the Allies could deliver. He wrote a 14-page analysis and tore the plan apart. Operationally unfeasible, he called it. Too many assumptions, too little logistics, too much faith in equipment still on drawing boards. He filed the report and expected that to be the end of his involvement. It was not the end. It was the beginning. Dwight Eisenhower read Frederick's critique and drew the opposite conclusion from the one Frederick intended. Here was an officer who understood Winter Mountain warfare well enough to dismantle a flawed plan point by point. If anyone could be trusted to build something better out of Pike's idea, it was the man who had just proven he wouldn't accept nonsense. Eisenhower hand-selected Frederick to organize, train, and command a new unit built on the wreckage of Operation Plough. The staff officer who had argued the concept would fail was now ordered to make it work. The Norway raid was quietly shelved. The men Frederick was assembling would go to war somewhere else, in a different kind of terrain entirely, but the force itself took shape exactly as Eisenhower had gambled it would. On July 9, 1942, the 1st Special Service Force was activated at Fort William Henry Harrison, Montana. Frederick, now a full colonel, stood in front of the 1st Volunteers and looked at something the American Army had never fielded before. a single regiment-sized unit, built from both American and Canadian soldiers, integrated company by company, wearing the same uniform, answering to the same chain of command. Two nations' worth of infantry, welded into one force, training together in the Montana mountains under a commander who, 8 months earlier, had said the whole concept wouldn't work. The training nearly killed men before the Germans got the chance. Parachute jumps, rock climbing, winter survival in temperatures that turned rifle oil to paste. Hand-to-hand combat drilled until it stopped being a technique and became instinct. Frederick did not watch from the sidelines. He climbed the same cliffs, jumped from the same aircraft, ate the same freezing rations, and the men noticed. A colonel who trained like a private earns a particular kind of loyalty, the kind that doesn't come from rank insignia. The Montana winters helped more than anyone wanted to admit. Wind that cut through wool like it wasn't there. Snow deep enough to swallow a man to the waist. Nights so cold that metal burned skin on contact and breath froze into a man's collar before he'd gone 100 yards. The volunteers who couldn't take it washed out early, quietly, sent back to conventional units without ceremony. The ones who stayed learned to move through terrain that would have stopped most infantry cold, literally. And they learned it because their commanding officer was out there in the same snow, breathing the same frozen air. By the time the force reached Italy in the fall of 1943, it had a nickname nobody had given it officially. Men called them the Black Devils, before the Germans ever coined the term themselves, simply because of what they did in the dark. In November 1943, the war in Italy had stalled against a mountain. Monte la Difensa rose out of the Mignano Gap like a wall, its slopes studded with German machine gun positions and its cliff faces considered, by any conventional military logic, unclimbable under fire. The 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division had tried to take it and failed. Other units from the same division tried and failed again. The Germans held La Difensa, and the answer was always the same. The approach was too exposed, the cliffs too steep, the defenders too well dug in. Frederick looked at the mountain and saw a problem of angles, not impossibility. The Germans had prepared for an assault from the direction any sane commander would choose. They had not prepared for men to come up the sheer rock face itself, in darkness, without artillery preparation to warn them it was coming. On the night of December 1st, Frederick's men marched 10 miles toward the base of the mountain. They rested through the following day in hidden positions, invisible to German observation posts scanning the valley below. Then, under cover of full darkness, they began to climb. Not a trail, not a switchback path. The cliff itself, hand over hand, weapons slung, using ropes where the rock demanded it, and bare grip where it didn't. Hours of silent, exhausting ascent. One mistake from a fall that would kill a man before he ever fired a shot. There was no sound but wind and breathing, and the occasional scrape of a boot against stone, quickly stilled. Fingers went numb on the rock. Muscles burned and then went past burning into something closer to numbness, and still the climb continued, man after man, rope after rope, the mountain rising black against a sky just barely lighter than the earth. Anyone who looked down risked losing the nerve to keep climbing. Anyone who looked up saw only more darkness, more rock, and, somewhere above, men who did not yet know they had already lost. Near the summit, German sentries stood their posts, unaware that an entire regiment-sized force was climbing up out of the darkness beneath them. Frederick's men did not open fire. Rifle shots would have alerted every position on the mountain and turned a surprise assault into a bloodbath on exposed rock. Instead, they used knives and bayonets, moving from position to position in silence, eliminating sentries one by one before the alarm could spread. By the time German defenders further up the mountain understood what was happening, the force was already among them. Monte la Difensa fell on December 2nd. Monte la Remetania, the connected peak beside it, fell the following day. Two objectives that had cost other divisions weeks of failed assaults were taken in a single night by a unit that, 14 months earlier, had existed only as a rejected proposal, on Robert Frederick's desk. When Eisenhower reported the capture to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister's response became the kind of line that follows a man for the rest of his career. Churchill called Robert Frederick the greatest fighting general of all time. Frederick did not have long to sit with the praise. 6 weeks later, in mid-January 1944, the force was committed to another mountain, Monte Majo, in fighting that ran from the 10th to the 13th of the month. This time, the man who led from the front paid for it directly. Frederick was wounded 3 times in that engagement, hit and hit again, and refused each time to be counted out of the fight he had started. For his conduct at Monte Majo, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations the United States Army could bestow, and one of 8 Purple Hearts he would collect before the war finally let him go home in one piece. By the end of January, the force had proven something no training exercise in Montana could have demonstrated. They could take terrain other units couldn't touch. They could move at night the way regular infantry moved in daylight. And their commander, the staff officer who had once written that this entire concept was unworkable, would bleed alongside his men rather than direct them from a map table in the rear. None of it had prepared them, not really, for what waited next. In early February 1944, the 1st Special Service Force received new orders. They were being pulled off the mountain fighting and sent north, to a beachhead that was already becoming one of the worst places any Allied soldier could be sent in the entire Italian campaign, a stretch of reclaimed marshland south of Rome, a landing that had promised a swift breakthrough and instead delivered a siege, a place called Anzio. They did not know yet that the fighting there would not be measured in mountains taken or peaks captured. It would be measured in something quieter and, in its own way, far more dangerous. An invisible network of German eyes watching every square yard of Allied ground, calling down artillery on anything that moved. Frederick's men were about to become hunters of a different kind of enemy, one that never fired a rifle, one that killed by proxy, from miles away, through a radio handset and a set of map coordinates. The Black Devils were going to the swamp. Anzio did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a drowned farm. The beachhead was reclaimed marshland, a flat expanse of drainage canals and irrigation ditches that Mussolini's engineers had spent a decade turning into productive fields, now churned back into mud by 5 months of shelling. There were no mountains here, no cliffs to climb in darkness. There was only flat, open ground, stretching toward German positions in every direction, and the constant, grinding knowledge that anything visible above the waterline was a target. The men who had climbed Monte la Difensa in the cold, clean air of the Apennines found something entirely different waiting for them here. The air over the marsh sat heavy and wet, thick with the smell of stagnant water and rotting reeds, and mosquitoes rose off the flooded fields in clouds thick enough to see at dusk. Reed grass grew shoulder-high in places, offering concealment that cut both ways, hiding a man from view one moment and hiding the man stalking him the next. Days blurred into a rhythm of digging deeper, staying low, and waiting for dark, because dark was the only hour when a man could move without inviting a shell down on his position. Nights carried their own sound, wind through the reeds, water lapping at canal banks, and underneath it, always, the low murmur of a war that never fully stopped, even when neither side was actively attacking. The force's assignment, when it arrived in early February 1944, told its own story about how little conventional logic applied to this stretch of the war. They were given roughly 8 miles of front along the Mussolini Canal and the Pontine Marshes, the entire right flank of the beachhead. 8 miles. That was more than twice the length of front held by the entire United States 3rd Infantry Division, a full division with more than 10 times the manpower. The force held it with fewer than 1,100 men. Across the canal, dug in and waiting, was a full German division, something close to 10,000 soldiers, with all the artillery, armor, and reserves that implied. On paper, it was not a defensible position. It was a gap waiting to be exploited, and everyone on the German side of the canal understood the arithmetic as well as anyone on the American side did. To understand why the force had been handed a task that looked almost impossible, it helps to understand what Anzio already was by the time they arrived. The landing in January had been sold as a knife to the throat of Rome, a surprise stroke that would collapse the German defensive lines further south and open the road to the capital. It had not worked that way. The American general in command had chosen to consolidate the beachhead rather than push inland while the Germans were still off balance. And by the time Allied troops tried to break out, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had already ringed the beachhead with every division he could scrape together, artillery positioned on the high ground with a clear view of nearly every square yard the Allies held below. Winston Churchill, reviewing the stalled operation from London, delivered a verdict that became as famous as the battle itself. He had hoped, he said, that the landing would hurl a wildcat onto the shore. Instead, all the Allies had produced was a stranded whale. The Germans compounded the misery deliberately. Sometime during the winter, they shut down the drainage pumps that had kept the reclaimed marshland dry since Mussolini's engineers first tamed it, and opened the dikes, letting brackish seawater flood back across the fields. It was not incidental damage. Standing water bred mosquitoes, and mosquitoes bred malaria, and a beachhead crammed with tens of thousands of men sleeping in shallow dugouts had no way to avoid either. By the time the siege ended in May, the Allied toll at Anzio would run past 7,000 killed, 36,000 wounded, and another 44,000 men sick, most of them from the fever breeding in the water the Germans had let loose. Overhead, when the artillery wasn't falling from conventional guns, it came from a pair of massive German railway guns the Americans nicknamed Anzio Annie, hurling 560-pound shells into the beachhead from so far away that the men on the receiving end rarely heard them coming until impact. This was the ground the force inherited. Not a front line in any traditional sense, but a flooded, malarial, endlessly shelled strip of reclaimed farmland where the enemy held every high point, and the only advantage available to the defenders was darkness itself. Most units facing those conditions would have dug in, hunkered down, and waited for the wider offensive further south to break the siege on its own timetable. That was not the answer Frederick was willing to accept for his men. Robert Frederick, recently promoted to brigadier general, looked at that arithmetic and made a decision that ran against every instinct of conventional defense. A thin line, held passively, invites the enemy to find its weak point and push through. Frederick did not intend to sit behind the Mussolini Canal and wait to be tested. He ordered his men to make the ground on the other side of the canal more dangerous for the Germans than the ground on his own side was for him. Every night, squads and platoons crossed into no man's land. Some patrols existed to disrupt, nothing more, cutting telephone lines, tearing down wire, forcing German units to spend daylight hours on repairs instead of preparation. Other patrols went deeper, sometimes as far as 1,500 feet behind the German line, deep enough that a man caught out there had no realistic hope of a friendly position to run for if things went wrong. Some patrols existed purely to bring prisoners back, snatched from forward outposts before they understood what was happening. Night after night, the same demand repeated itself. Go out, cause damage, come back before dawn, and do it again the following night. The men who crossed the canal did not go looking like soldiers. Faces smeared black with boot polish, silhouettes broken up against the marsh grass. They became, in the words the Germans themselves eventually settled on, something closer to ghosts than infantry. Every patrol began the same way, gear checked and rechecked so nothing could rattle or catch the moonlight, weapons slung rather than carried, knives kept close because a knife made no sound and gave away no muzzle flash. Men moved in short bursts between cover, freezing at the first hint of a flare overhead, learning to read the rhythm of German sentries the way a hunter reads the habits of game. A patrol that went out 8 strong and came back 8 strong, having left nothing behind but a cut wire or an empty machine gun nest, counted as a good night. It was in these weeks that the nickname earned in the mountains hardened into something both sides used without irony: the Black Devils. Die Schwarzen Teufel. Frederick gave the psychological side of the war a physical form. He ordered small printed cards produced, bearing the force's insignia and a single line of German text, Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The literal translation was blunt, almost bureaucratic. The thick end is coming soon, but the men who found these cards understood the intended meaning without difficulty. The worst is yet to come. Forcemen pasted them to the chests of German dead, to helmets left on overrun positions, to fortifications raided and abandoned before dawn. A German soldier standing sentry duty did not need to see a force patrol to know one had been there. He only needed to find the card. The effect on German morale was not something the force had to guess at. Prisoners captured in the following weeks described it themselves, some of them barely believing what they were confessing. Interrogators recorded confusion that bordered on disbelief when captured men learned the truth about the unit's size. A German lieutenant, taken during one of the raids, admitted under questioning that he had assumed the force facing his sector was a full division. He could not reconcile the scale of the damage, the constant pressure, the relentless string of missing outposts and captured men, with a unit smaller than a single American regiment. A German officer facing the sector put the feeling into words in his own journal, in language that read less like a combat report than a confession. "The black devils are all around us every time we come into the line," he wrote. "We never hear them come. It was not the kind of thing an army writes about an enemy it expects to defeat through conventional means." No soldier embodied what the force was becoming during those weeks more completely than a sergeant from Manitoba named Tommy Prince, a man whose skill in that flooded landscape would earn him a reputation the German army mistook for something supernatural. Prince had grown up on the broken-head Ojibwe nation, a descendant of Peguis, the Saulteaux chief who had led his people to the Red River generations earlier. He had crossed into the United States Army recruiting stations effectively as a volunteer for a war his own government back home would spend decades failing to properly honor him for. At Anzio, he became something the German army had no doctrine to counter. On February 8, 1944, near the town of Litoria, Prince was sent forward alone, deep into territory the force did not control, with a single mission: find the German assembly points and artillery positions building up behind the line, and report them accurately enough for Allied guns to hit them. He found an abandoned farmhouse roughly 700 feet from a German assembly area and set up an observation post inside it. Then, alone, in territory that offered no retreat if he was discovered, he ran out 4,600 feet of telephone wire back toward Allied lines and began to report. He stayed in that farmhouse for hours, watching German positions through whatever gap in the walls gave him a clean line of sight, relaying coordinates over the wire as Allied artillery walked its fire onto targets he was calling in real time. Every minute inside that farmhouse was a minute in which discovery meant no rescue, no covering fire, no retreat, only the certainty of what happened to a man caught operating alone behind enemy lines. He stayed anyway, adjusting fire call after fire call, watching German positions come apart under barrages he himself had aimed. At one point during the observation, the telephone line itself was cut, likely by shell fire from his own side's bombardment. Prince did not withdraw. He changed into civilian clothing he had apparently anticipated needing, walked out into the open under the pretense of tending a farm field between the lines, located the break in the wire, repaired it in full view of both armies, and returned to his post to keep reporting. His citation for the military medal, when it came, read in part that his courage and utter disregard for personal safety were an inspiration to his fellows, and a marked credit to his unit. That was not the only shape his war took at Anzio. On nights when silence mattered more than speed, Prince would trade his boots for a pair of moccasins carried folded in his pack, soft-soled and nearly silent against wet ground where a standard-issue boot would betray a man's position with every step. He crossed into German-held territory on these nights, not to observe from a distance, but to walk directly into where German soldiers slept. He left warnings. He took boots and equipment from men too deep asleep to notice a stranger crouched beside them. On occasion, when a sentry stood between him and the way out, He used a knife rather than risk a shot that would bring an entire position down on him. German soldiers who survived encounters with whatever had moved through their lines overnight struggled to explain what they had seen, and the words they reached for were not military terms. Geist, ghost, Teufel, devil. Frederick did not stay behind the canal directing this campaign from a command post either, any more than he had stayed off the cliffs at Monte la Defensa. During one patrol that walked, unknowingly, into a German minefield and was pinned down under machine gun fire with wounded men unable to move, Frederick went forward himself into the same field to help get the injured out. In the chaos, a medic dragging a badly wounded man toward safety turned and barked at a figure crawling nearby who seemed to be hanging back. "Don't just stand there, you stupid bastard," the medic shouted. "Grab hold of the other end of the litter." The man grabbed the litter and helped carry the wounded soldier clear of the minefield without a word of complaint. It was only afterward, once they were both out of the field, that the medic realized the soldier he had just cursed at and ordered around was Brigadier General Robert Frederick. It was the same pattern that had defined him since Montana, a general who measured his orders by whether he was willing to be standing beside the men receiving them, rank insignia be damned once the shooting started. That same willingness ran through the men under him. A soldier named Wendell Johnson walked into a minefield under fire to reach a wounded comrade and carried him out on his own back, the kind of act that should have earned a medal without question. When his commanders tried to put him forward for one, Johnson turned it down. "Give it to the man who lost his leg," he said. It was not a line rehearsed for effect. It was simply how the force had come to think of itself by the spring of 1944, a unit where the men who did the saving considered the men who paid the price the ones who deserved to be remembered. The cost of that pattern caught up with him at Anzio the way it had at Montemaggio. He was wounded more than once during the months the force held the Mussolini Canal, and on at least one occasion he was hit twice in the same day, wounds that would have sent most officers to a hospital bed for the remainder of the campaign. Frederick did not leave his command. He had aid men patch what could be patched in the field and kept going, refusing evacuation the way he had refused, back in Montana, to let anyone else climb the cliffs his men had to climb. Each wound became another entry in a tally that would eventually reach 8 Purple Hearts by the time the war released him, a number so unusual for a general officer that it would follow his name in official histories for the rest of the century, cited by later historians as evidence of a command style built on shared risk rather than delegated danger. None of this was accidental, and none of it was cheap. The pressure the force applied was not abstract. It produced a measurable result that both sides could see. Within roughly 3 weeks of the force taking over the sector, German units had pulled back so far from the canal that force patrols could no longer reach them and returned to friendly lines within a single night's darkness. The enemy was retreating not from an offensive, not from a breakthrough, but from the accumulated psychological weight of not knowing which night the ghosts would come for their position next. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, found himself diverting more troops to fortify the sector opposite the force than he had ever planned to commit there. Manpower pulled away from other parts of a beachhead the Allies were still struggling to break out of. Prisoners came back across the canal in numbers that surprised even the men bringing them in. Not stray sentries caught alone in the dark, but entire platoons, in some cases entire companies, marched back at gunpoint by patrols a fraction of their size, disarmed so quickly and quietly that men in neighboring German positions sometimes did not realize their comrades were gone until roll call the next morning. Every captured German added to a picture Allied intelligence was assembling of a unit that punched enormously above its numerical weight, and every captured German who described what they thought they were facing only reinforced the fiction the force had built for itself in the minds of the men across the canal. Interrogation reports piled up, describing a force of division strength, phantom battalions that existed nowhere except in the fear of men who had never actually counted how few soldiers it took to empty an outpost in a single night. Not every mission ended cleanly. On March 14, 1944, Frederick's 37th birthday, First Lieutenant T. Mark Radcliffe led a 5-man patrol across the Mussolini Canal to set an ambush deep in German-held ground. Somewhere in the crossing, Radcliffe stopped to investigate a sound that shouldn't have been there, separated for a moment from the rest of his patrol, and found himself surrounded by 4 or 5 German soldiers before he could react. He was taken prisoner and marched to the town of Littoria for interrogation. His captors made one mistake that would matter enormously in the weeks that followed. They never blindfolded him. Radcliffe spent his transport and interrogation memorizing everything a trained officer's eye could take in: troop positions, unit markings, the layout of roads and defenses behind the German line, information no prisoner should have been allowed to carry with him. He gave his interrogators his name, rank, and serial number, and nothing else, while quietly cataloging every detail of the route between his capture point and the interrogation center in Littoria. The same discipline drilled into every force volunteer back in Montana, now working against the men who had captured him. In less than 30 days, Radcliffe escaped his captors, not once but twice, evading recapture through territory that offered no clear path back to friendly lines, moving mostly at night and living off whatever he could scavenge, applying the same lessons about patience and cover that had defined every force patrol since the mountains. He made his way back to the force carrying a mental map of the enemy's rear areas that Allied intelligence had been trying to piece together for months. A prisoner's ordeal turned, through sheer stubbornness, into one of the more valuable intelligence hauls of the entire Anzio campaign. By the time the Anzio campaign entered its final weeks in May 1944, the force had held its stretch of the Mussolini Canal for 99 consecutive days of raids, patrols, and nightly harassment, without ever being pulled out of the line for rest the way a conventional unit would have been. The cost had not been small. 106 men killed or missing, more than 300 wounded, numbers that meant almost every man in the unit had either been hit himself or had carried a friend who had, on top of the malaria and dysentery that the flooded marsh handed out to friend and enemy alike, regardless of how carefully a man kept his head down. But the line had held. More than held, it had bled the will out of the German division across from it. One missing outpost and one calling card at a time, until an enemy that outnumbered the force nearly 10-1 had chosen to retreat from ghosts rather than stand and fight men they could never quite manage to see coming. Robert Frederick, still in command, still carrying the wounds Anzio and Monte Maggio had left in him, had spent 99 days proving that 8 miles of flooded ground and fewer than 1,100 men could hold against a division, provided the men holding it made the enemy more afraid of the dark than the Americans were. Whatever came next in Italy, that lesson was not going to be forgotten by the men who had lived it. The breakout from Anzio was about to begin, and the men who had spent 99 nights turning a marsh into a hunting ground were about to be pointed toward Rome. In May 1944, after months of stalemate, the wider Italian campaign finally broke open. Operation Diadem, the Allied offensive that had been building for weeks along the southern front, shattered the German defensive lines that had held Monte Cassino and the roads to Rome for the better part of a year. With the southern front collapsing, the order finally came for the men trapped behind the Mussolini Canal. After 99 days of holding a line no one thought could be held, the force was not being pulled back for rest. It was being sent forward, into the breakout, at the tip of the spear. They moved the way they had trained to move since Montana, fast and aggressive, punching through positions that a conventional unit would have paused to reduce with artillery first. The German army that had spent 3 months learning to fear the dark now faced the force in daylight, in open movement, and found that the same unit that had haunted their nights could fight just as effectively in full view. Town after town along the route north fell to the advance. The momentum of 99 nights of aggression converted, almost overnight, into the momentum of a conventional offensive that refused to slow down. Men who had spent 3 months crawling through mud on their elbows now rode forward in the open, and the change in posture alone told the story of how completely the balance on that stretch of front had shifted. The marsh, the malaria, the endless waiting for dark, all of it fell away behind them within days, replaced by the strange, disorienting speed of an army that was finally allowed to move. By the first days of June, the road to Rome itself lay open, and the race to reach the city first became a matter of real strategic urgency. Retreating German units had wired the bridges spanning the Tiber for demolition, intending to blow them behind their own withdrawal and leave the advancing Allies stranded on the wrong side of the river, buying precious time to reorganize a new defensive line further north. Whoever reached those bridges first, before the charges could be detonated, would decide how much of the city survived intact and how quickly the pursuit could continue. The task went to a patrol built around the same officer who had spent 30 days that spring escaping German captivity by memorizing everything his captors failed to hide from him. Captain T. Mark Radcliffe, promoted since his escape, led a small mechanized column, 18 jeeps and 2 armored cars, racing ahead of the main advance with a single mission: reach the city, secure 7 key bridges, and hold them before retreating German engineers could finish what they had started. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 4, 1944, Radcliffe's patrol crossed into Rome. They were the first Allied troops to enter the city, ahead of every other unit in the theater, moving through streets that did not yet know the occupation was ending. Robert Frederick was at the front of that advance, as he had been at the front of every advance since the cliffs of Monte la Difensa. The final push into Rome cost him more wounds, adding to a tally that had already begun to seem less like misfortune and more like an inevitable consequence of how he chose to lead. By the time the fighting for the city was over, Frederick had been wounded so many times across the Italian campaign that officers who studied his record afterward struggled to find another American general who had been hit as often and stayed in command through all of it. There was no ceremony to any of it by this point, no sense among the men around him that a general being wounded again was remarkable. It had become simply what happened when Frederick led an assault, the way weather happened, an expected cost of doing business with a commander who had never once, since Montana, asked his men to go somewhere he was unwilling to go himself. The wounds accumulated the way the calling cards had accumulated on German corpses back at the canal, evidence left behind of a man who kept showing up exactly where the fighting was worst. Rome fell without the wholesale destruction the Germans had planned. The bridges Radcliffe's patrol secured stayed standing. 2 days after the greatest Allied capital in occupied Europe changed hands, the world's attention would shift almost entirely to a beach in Normandy, and the men who had bled for 99 days in a Mussolini canal marsh and then fought their way into Rome ahead of every other unit in Italy would find their accomplishment folded quietly into the back pages of a war that was about to get much larger. The force did not stay in Italy long enough to enjoy the city it had helped liberate. By August, Frederick had been given command of a new formation, the 1st Airborne Task Force, built with the force at its core, and on August 15, 1944, that task force dropped and landed as part of Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. It was a new front, a new fight, and Frederick led it the same way he had led every fight before it, from as close to the front as his rank technically allowed, and often closer than it did. The winter that followed brought the end. The war in southern France ground into the Maritime Alps, a static, exhausting campaign far removed from the daring night raids that had made the force's reputation, and by the closing weeks of 1944, the joint American-Canadian arrangement that had made the unit unique from the beginning had become an administrative complication its two governments no longer wanted to manage. The 1st Special Service Force, the Black Devils, the unit built from a rejected Norwegian commando proposal by a staff officer who once argued the whole concept wouldn't work, was disbanded. Its American and Canadian soldiers were split apart and redistributed into other airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st among them, absorbed into units that would carry the fighting through to the end of the war, without the name that had once made German soldiers write about ghosts in their journals. What the force left behind did not disappear with the disbandment order. Years later, when the United States Army built a new kind of unit for a new kind of war, Unconventional warfare specialists trained to operate behind enemy lines in small, self-sufficient teams, the lineage they claimed for themselves ran directly back to Frederick's Black Devils. The 10th Special Forces Group, activated in 1952 under an OSS veteran named Aaron Bank, became the foundation of what the world would eventually know as the Green Berets, and the U.S. Army's official Special Forces lineage traces itself, without interruption, to the unit constituted in July 1942 for a raid on Norway that never happened. Canada's own Special Operations Forces claim the same ancestry. The badge those modern soldiers wear still carries an echo of the force's original insignia: red arrowheads and crossed arrows, borrowed from the symbolism of Indian scout units, a design chosen 80 years earlier by men who had no way of knowing how long their unit's shadow would stretch. The men themselves went home to lives the war had complicated in ways no citation could fix. Robert Frederick's body never fully recovered from what Italy had cost him. Doctors would later trace lasting damage to carbon monoxide exposure he had suffered at Anzio, compounding the physical toll of wounds that had never been given time to properly heal before the next campaign began. His heart was enlarged. He was deaf in one ear, with damage to the other. His right leg carried permanent injury from wounds sustained across Italy and France. He continued to serve, commanding occupation forces in post-war Austria, leading a stateside infantry division, taking on a role advising Greek military forces in the early 1950s. But his body had been spending itself since a mountain called Monte la Difensa, and in March 1952, at the age of 44, the Army medically retired him. He died on November 29, 1970, and was buried in the National Cemetery at the Presidio of San Francisco, the same city where he had been born 63 years earlier, to a doctor and a nurse who could not have imagined what their son would become. Tommy Prince came home to a country that could not decide how to honor him. He remained, for the rest of his life, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history, holder of both the Military Medal and the American Silver Star, a man whose wartime service had been extraordinary by any measure applied to any soldier of any background. And under the terms of Canada's Indian Act, that same government he had risked his life for did not allow him to vote in a federal election, and denied him access to the same veterans' benefits offered to the non-Indigenous soldiers who had served beside him. He spent much of the rest of his life advocating for First Nations rights, pushing against the very legal framework that had welcomed his sacrifice in wartime and dismissed his citizenship in peace. He died on November 25, 1977. More than 500 people attended his funeral. Neither man talked much in later years about what the war had actually been like inside the Mussolini Canal marshes, the smell of stagnant water, the calling cards left on dead men's chests, the sound of nothing at all where a scream should have been. That silence was, in its own way, the last thing the Black Devils left behind. A generation of quiet men who had once made an entire German division afraid of the dark, and who came home asking for nothing except, in Wendell Johnson's words, "That credit go to the ones who paid more than they did." What remained decades later was not a single monument or a single famous name, but a lineage, a badge, and a habit of mind that modern special operations soldiers still trace back to a flooded canal in Italy, and a staff officer who once said, "The whole idea would never work."